There are things fathers share with their children, stories of youth, lessons learned the hard way, memories softened by time. And then there are the other things, the ones they carry alone, tucked into the quiet corners of their hearts, held not out of pride or shame, but out of a quiet understanding that some truths are too heavy to pass on. Ronald Reagan, such a truth. And for more than 40 years, he kept it hidden in the back drawer of an old wooden desk, beneath envelopes of tax papers and birthday cards, buried under the ordinary clutter of life, as though hiding it in plain sight made the secret less painful. The children never knew about the drawer. Staff never opened it. Nancy, intuitive as she was, respected it without question. Inside that drawer sat a single object wrapped in aging. Yellow paper. A letter addressed not to Nancy, not to his children, not to any member of his staff, but to himself, written in a handwriting so familiar it startled him every time he unfolded it. A letter he had written the night he believed he might lose everything, a letter he never sent, never shared, never dared explain. He kept it because it reminded him of a choice that shaped the man he ultimately became. And on the evening, this story begins years after he left office. Years before illness would begin dimming the clarity of his thoughts, Reagan sat alone at that desk once more, staring at the drawer he had avoided opening for nearly a decade. The house was quiet, the kind of deep, warm quiet that comes only after sunset, when the lights are low. The world has stopped knocking, and even memory moves more gently. A lamp glowed softly beside him, casting a warm halo across the papers he had been pretending to read. Outside, wind stirred the trees, brushing dry leaves across the porch. Something tugged at him. Something old. Something unresolved. He reached for the drawer. His fingers trembled not with age, but with recognition, because that drawer did not hold documents. It held a version of himself he rarely revisited. When he slid it open, the faint scent of old paper drifted upward. He moved aside a small stack of envelopes and lifted the yellow-wrapped bundle beneath. The paper crackled softly under his fingertips. For a long moment, he simply held it. It amazed him, even now, how something so light could carry so much weight. He unwrapped the letter slowly, revealing the familiar handwriting on the front. "To the man I hope I can still become." He had written that line in 1968. He remembered the room. He remembered the cold. He remembered the moment he realized he might have failed someone who depended on him. But he did not open the letter yet. Instead, as he often did, he let memory take him back to the night he wrote it, back to the choice he made, back to the moment he decided never to tell his children, because some truths, he believed, were meant to be carried by one heart alone. It was the winter of 1968, and California had been shaken by a storm that seemed to mirror the tension in Reagan's own life. Winds battered the coast with a force that rattled windows, sent branches tumbling across highways, and knocked out power in towns that rarely saw weather this fierce. Reagan was governor then, still new enough in the role to feel its weight every time he put on his jacket. The hours were unforgiving. The decisions were relentless. And the growing pressure from national figures urging him to take the next step, to pursue ambitions. He wasn't sure he wanted pressed in from every direction, but that night, none of those responsibilities mattered. He had received a phone call just after dusk, the kind of phone call that turns the world suddenly silent, the kind of phone call that makes the bones in your legs feel hollow. His father was in trouble again, Jack. Reagan had been a complicated man, warm, humorous, lovable in ways only flawed men can be. But he had fought demons all his life. Alcohol had taken much from him, opportunities, relationships, moments of clarity, and sometimes even the trust of those who loved him. Reagan carried love for his father the way some men carry scars deeply, quietly, without ever being fully free of them. When the phone rang, he knew. Before he answered, he knew. A family friend spoke the words he dreaded. "He's been drinking again. And he's disappeared. We can't find him, Ronnie." Storm was raging. Roads were flooding. Officials warned people not to travel, but Reagan didn't hesitate. He put on his coat, grabbed his keys, and left. Security offered to drive. He refused. Some roads you walked alone? He remembered the storm's fury, how the wind slapped against his body as if trying to turn him back. But the fear of losing his father to the cold, to the bottle, to chance, was stronger. He drove for hours, searching back roads and alleys, stopping at bars, asking strangers if they'd seen a man fitting his father's description. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles burned. The windshield fogged. The roads blurred. He checked shelters, emergency stations, even ditches along the highway. Nothing. By midnight, exhaustion pulled at him. He stopped the car and rested his forehead against the steering wheel, whispering a quiet plea no one would ever hear. Please, let me find him, please. Didn't realize he was shaking until tears hit his hands. He had been angry at his father. Before, ashamed, frustrated, disappointed. But this was different. Tonight, he was afraid. He imagined the worst, his father alone. Freezing, confused, falling into a sleep from which he wouldn't wake. He imagined the guilt, the headlines, the shame of being a public figure who could not save his own parent. He imagined telling his children. He imagined not being able to. And then, a faint light. A glow just beyond the trees near a service road. Reagan raised his head. The light flickered. Not lightning. Not a street lamp. A lantern. He left the car door open and ran there. Near the base of a large oak tree, twisted by age and wind, sat a figure hunched against the trunk. Snow gathered in the folds of his coat. His hat lay in the mud. His shoulders were slumped, as though the storm itself had bent him. Dad. The figure didn't respond. Reagan's breath caught. He moved closer. Dad. It's Meets, Ronnie. At the sound of his son's voice, Jack Reagan lifted his head slightly. Just enough for their eyes to meet. And in those eyes, Reagan saw something he had never seen before. Fear. Not the fear of the storm. Not the fear of dying. The fear of disappointing his son beyond repair. Ronnie. Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean to make you come. Reagan knelt in front of him, cupping his father's face in both hands. You scared me, he said, his voice breaking. Dad, you scared me. Jack shook his head weakly. You shouldn't have to carry me. Not anymore. Reagan closed his eyes, fighting the flood of emotion. You're my father, he whispered. There's no world where I don't come for you. The wind howled around them, but Reagan barely heard it. He lifted his father into his arms slowly, carefully, as though handling something fragile. Let's get you home, he murmured. Jack rested his head against his son's shoulder, his breath warm against Reagan's neck. I'm sorry, he whispered. I know, Reagan replied, his voice trembling. I know. And it was in that moment, carrying his father through the storm, that Reagan felt something inside himself shift. A shift so profound he would later write about it in the letter he hid away. Because as he carried his father, he realized his greatest fear was not that his father would fail him. His greatest fear was that he would someday fail his own children in the same way. Later that night, after Jack was safe and asleep, Reagan sat alone at his desk, exhausted, shaken, awake in a way he had never been awake before. He pulled a blank sheet of paper toward him and wrote, To the man I hope I can still become. A letter about fear, about forgiveness, about the burden of inherited pain, about the hope that he would break the cycle instead of repeating it. A letter he never wanted anyone to read. A letter he wrote to make sure he never forgot the promise he made to himself under the storm. A promise he kept. But the part he never shared, the part even his children never knew, was why the letter needed to exist in the first place. Because that night, as he carried his father through the wind, he realized something he would never forget. We are shaped as much by the people we save as by the people we fail. And the letter contained the one sentence. Reagan feared his children might someday misunderstand the sentence he wrote in trembling handwriting. I wasn't strong enough to save him from his demons, but I will be strong enough to keep mine from reaching you. He folded the letter, placed it in the drawer, and never spoke of it again. 4 days after the storm, Reagan carried an uneasiness inside him, something heavy, something he couldn't name, something that lived in the space between fear and responsibility. He went through the motions of being governor, shaking hands, reviewing documents, delivering speeches, but his thoughts drifted back, again and again, to the image of his father sitting helplessly under that old oak tree. It wasn't just worry. It wasn't just grief. It was recognition. Recognition of the truth he had written in the letter, tucked into his drawer. I wasn't strong enough to save him from his demons, but I will be strong enough to keep mine from reaching you. That line haunted him, not because it was untrue, but because it was more true than he wanted to admit. He had spent his whole life trying to outrun the darker shadows of his father's struggles. He had built discipline where his father had surrendered. He had built stability where his father had stumbled. But fear was the demon that still lived inside him, one that whispered quietly when no one else was around. What if you pass this on too? What if you fail them the way he failed you? What if love isn't enough? He loved his children fiercely, more fiercely than he ever loved anything on earth. But love alone does not silence fear. Love only gives it context. A week after the incident, Reagan visited his father again, not as governor, not as a public figure, but as a son still carrying the weight of that night. Jack was recovering slowly. He was sober, alert, ashamed in the quiet way people are when they know they've hurt someone without meaning to. When Reagan entered the room, Jack lowered his gaze. "Ronnie," he began, voice unsteady. "I don't know what to say." Reagan didn't speak for a moment. He walked to the window and stared out at the lawn, at the sunlight hitting the grass, at birds hopping from branch to branch. Simple things that felt distant. "You scared me," Reagan said finally. His voice was not angry. It was tired. It was honest. "I didn't mean to," Jack replied, swallowing hard. "I swear to God I didn't mean to." Reagan exhaled slowly. "I know." Jack lifted his head. "You shouldn't have had to come for me. Not at your age. Not with everything you're doing. I should have been the one protecting you." Reagan closed his eyes. "That's not how life works," he said gently. "We carry each other. Sometimes you carried me. Sometimes I carry you." Jack shook his head. "Not enough. Not the way fathers are supposed to." Reagan turned to him then, fully, looked into the face of the man who had shaped him in good ways, in painful ways, in ways he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. "Dad," Reagan said quietly, "I forgave you a long time ago." Jack's lips quivered. "Why?" "Because I needed to," Reagan whispered. "Because I didn't want to become a man who resented the person who gave him life. Because I saw the good in you, even on the days you couldn't see it in yourself." A silence stretched between them, heavy but healing. Jack wiped his eyes. "I'm sorry for everything." Reagan stepped forward and gently rested his hand on his father's shoulder. "I know," he said, "but I don't want you drowning in that. I want you here. I want you trying." "That's enough." Jack nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. For the first time in years, Reagan saw a glimmer of peace in his father's eyes, fragile, fleeting, but real. And yet, even as reconciliation unfolded in that quiet room, Reagan felt the letter burning like a coal in his pocket. A reminder that forgiveness did not erase fear. Months passed. Life moved. Reagan returned to work, 2 speeches, 2 decisions that shaped millions of lives. But the incident with his father stayed with him, not as a wound, but as a compass. He watched his children more closely, listened more gently, softened his voice in moments where he might once have raised it. He stayed up late when they were troubled. He offered presence when they needed distance. He paid attention not just to what they said, but to what they didn't. He became, without ever saying so, the man his father had wished he could be. And yet, he never told his children the truth about that night. He never told them how terrified he had been. He never told them how he carried his father through the storm. He never told them about the letter. He never told them about the fear that lived inside him, the fear of becoming what he had saved his father from. Some truths, he believed were gifts best left unshared. He didn't want his children carrying the burden of his doubts. He didn't want them wondering whether they might inherit his father's struggles, or his fears, or his shadows. He wanted them to inherit only his love. Years passed, decades. Reagan aged. His children grew into adults, with lives of their own. Nancy remained his anchor, steady, elegant, intuitive, endlessly patient. One evening, long after he had left the White House, he sat at the same wooden desk where he had written the letter years before. The sun was setting outside, turning the sky a soft gold that reminded him of childhood summers in Illinois. He reached for the drawer again. His hands were slower now, but sure. He unwrapped the fragile yellow paper and unfolded the letter. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear. He read them silently, his lips moving just enough to catch the rhythm of the younger version of himself. Then he stopped at the final line. "I will be strong enough to keep mine from reaching you." His throat tightened. Because despite all those years, despite all the storms he had weathered, despite the legacy he had built, he still wasn't sure he had succeeded. He had been a good father in many ways, and flawed in others. Human, always human. He wondered whether he had protected his children from the deepest parts of himself, or simply hidden those parts behind love and duty. Suddenly a soft knock came at the door. It was Patty, Dad. She asked gently, "You okay?" Reagan folded the letter quickly, almost instinctively. "Just thinking," he said with a smile. "About what?" He hesitated. For a moment he considered telling her. Considered handing her the letter. Considered opening the drawer of secrets and letting her see the man behind the father. But then he saw her eyes, so full of warmth, of worry, of trust, and he knew. He knew this story belonged to him alone. Just memories. He said softly. She walked over and kissed his cheek. "Well, I'm glad you're here." "I love you, Dad," he smiled. "I love you too." When she left, Reagan looked at the letter once more. Then, with a quiet breath, he folded it carefully and placed it back into the drawer. The secret remained. Not because he was ashamed. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood something his father had never been able to give him. A parent's job is not to pass on their burdens. It is to shield their children from the weight they themselves had to carry. And Reagan carried it well. Quietly, faithfully, lovingly, all his life. If this story touched your heart, your support helps keep these gentle memories alive. A like, comment, or subscription helps more than you know. Thank you for listening.